we're turning things around. We're heading in the right direction. I think we went from it going backwards to forward to moving forward, but we still got a lot of work to be done. And so by no means are we here to tell you that work's all done, patting ourselves on the back. We've got a lot of work to do together, but I think we've built a great foundation, and we're going to continue to put the hardworking taxpayers of the state's interest up front. So that's kind of the beginning of what we announced, what we were doing over in Manitowoc. The beauty of what we did, though, is we empower local officials, people we elect, duly elect at the local level, and the people they then employ, like superintendents, to make those decisions. Prior to Act 10, those decisions were essentially limited to a state law that put the power in a handful of essentially union leaders at the state and the local level. And so to me it was real simple. Do you put it in the hands of the taxpayers who duly elect individuals, be it at the city, the school district, or the county, or do you limit it through the old law to a handful of people who may or may not have the best interests of the taxpayers at heart? So there are going to be differences, there are nuances. Andre's right, there are things that long precede my role or anybody here at this table being in office in terms of the school aid formula and things of that nature, and hopefully as the economy increases, as revenues get back in better places because of our reforms and other things looking into the future, we can tackle some of the issues of things like school aid formulas and that issue. But clearly, and Andre, you're right, that even though you're new, you're very perceptive on that, you can't make changes to 424 school districts without an ability to hold those who would potentially lose harmless and build off a new formula. Because any of these folks here know, well, you can have 90% of the districts in your legislative district win, but the 10% are the ones you're going to hear from, and so there's got to be a way to hold them harmless. That would be true with or without Act 10. What we do is just allow local officials to better control their own destiny.
Is that Act 10 is about much, much more than just a contribution for insurance and to the pension plan. It's about freeing up managers to be innovative and to solve problems rather than being hamstrung by the inflexibility of 35 years of mediation arbitration generated work rules that get in the way of progress and reacting to the modern world. And this is what the anecdotes really will begin to snowball as more and more do that. But Manitowoc should get credit for being early on that curve and not late. Many other school districts will just be beginning the evolution when their contracts finally come up at the end of June, I suspect.
There's one other interesting benefit, just as a tangent off of this. Steve's exactly right. It not only helps in terms of savings potential for school districts, and actually a lot of our other local governments use those same reforms. It was just the most obvious in terms of school districts. But the other benefit of that, particularly, is it's not even just bidding things out, but putting in place systems that have all of us as participants in the healthcare system having more skin in the game, be more active participants in not just our healthcare decisions when it comes to insurance, but in terms of our wellness and health decisions, is, I think, part of the reason why Wisconsin in the past, in the private sector as well as the public sector, had much higher healthcare costs than many other parts of the country. There are Medicare and Medicaid issues along with that, was because of so many people in the public sector having little or no contribution or involvement in their health insurance. Getting all of us more actively involved in that will not only help the taxpayers directly in terms of savings there, I think it lowers utilization or overutilization of healthcare in the marketplace as a whole, which helps providers keep healthcare costs under control, which will help people outside of government as well, as because those factors in the past, the more you had people, be it in a government bureaucracy or even a private sector bureaucracy, that didn't have plans that had some skin in the game, doesn't have to have a lot, but something in there, the more likely people were to overutilize that health care. The more people are involved and engaged, the more likely they are to make decisions not just about health insurance, but ultimately about their own wellness that keep costs under control.
Exam?
Well, there's a difference between legislation, which we'd certainly be willing to look at in the future, should I have the honor of serving after June 5th as the governor again. The reason we didn't include fire and police in the first place was simply a practical matter. We saw what happened, not many, but a handful of school districts, teachers walked off the job. We saw it in Madison firsthand in the Capitol, where for several days, teachers walked off, and that left a lot of parents high and dry. Nobody's health was at risk. And really my concern was, even though the vast majority of people in law enforcement and fire protection, I believe, are such great professionals, they would never dream of putting anyone at risk. If it just took one municipality where someone took some sort of job action and reaction like we saw from others, I didn't want to take that risk at the time. Moving forward, what you've seen is a lot of municipalities have actually been able to work with public safety unions to get similar savings to what other public employees have, and I think that wouldn't have happened had not for Act 10 and the reforms we put in place. And in the future, I think there's probably some room for discussion on that as in terms of applying it to others. But the reason we didn't include it in the first place was simply a practical matter.
Vision for education in the future.
Yeah, two different parts. Let me talk both about what we've done and, more importantly, where we're headed. I think there's no doubt about it. You look, one of the biggest pieces of our budget, about 45% of the total budget goes to education. Just the public education in the state of Wisconsin. People forget that it's not state agencies, it's not other things. It's almost 60% when you include every other local government along with schools out there. Having a $3.6 billion budget deficit, having a budget that not only had it at the time, but was based on one-time stimulus money in the past for Medicaid and school aid deficits, was based on all sorts of other really poor budgeting issues, reining that all in. That's why Moody's called our budget credit positive. The same agency that downgraded Illinois has called ours credit positive. Put us in a better position, and it put us in a better position not just at the state level, but now, as I mentioned, schools at the local level have a better position to be able to control their own destiny. I know that firsthand. I got two kids who go to public high school in Wauwatosa. Their school district Wauwatosa, was one of those that benefited from their reforms and actually hired more teachers. So we saw it firsthand in our school district, just like many parents did across the state. Moving forward, and Steve knows this firsthand because he was very intricately involved in this, it hardly gets any coverage. And you guys may have covered it. I don't see it daily. I see snippets here and there, so no disregard for you if you've covered it. But one of the frustrating things about what we've done with education reform is it barely gets any coverage because it's not controversial. The reason for that is Tony Evers and I last March sat down and said, you know what, we may be strange bedfellows politically, but we have a shared interest in education of every kid in this state. And so we put together a Read the Lead task force, of which these lawmakers and overwhelmingly in both political parties helped us pass legislation to change that. We worked with Dr. Evers on the educator effectiveness to make sure that we could effectively replicate success amongst great teachers and find a way to lift up and mentor those who are failing to meet that standard. And we're in the final stages in putting together the final plans in terms of the school and school district accountability system, where Steve was intricately involved along with Luther Olson, who chairs the Senate committee. And then Dr. Evers and I brought together about 40 different stakeholders from around the state to say, we don't want to live by the No Child Left Behind, one-size-fits-all mandate from the federal government. We want to have just as high or higher standards, but we want them to be Wisconsin standards based not just on one test, but on a series of assessments that accurately reflect not only accountability for teachers, but for schools and school districts as well. That's I think a great example. People look at not only where you're going, but how do you do it? Because the one complaint I think is legitimate about what we did with Act 10 is, I came in overwhelmingly like someone in a small business instead of someone in politics and said, here's a problem, here's the solution, now just fix it. I fixed it before I explained it. The problem usually in politics is people talk about it and never fix it. So of the two, I'd rather fix it first and then explain it. But I legitimately understand people's concerns saying, hey, you know what, where did this come from? I talked about in the campaign, I actually ran ads in the 5 and the 12%, but even in the early stages, if I had spent time last January saying, do you know that school districts all across the state overwhelmingly, not all, but most of them have to buy their health insurance from just one company, and that's costing them tens of millions of dollars? Do you know that overtime abuses, whether it's in the State Department of Corrections or in the city of Madison, where they have a city bus driver who got paid $150,000 because of overtime abuse? If I'd explained that clearly, I think the taxpayers of the state, no matter whether they're Democrat or Republican or somewhere in between, would have said, Governor, you need to fix that. because we fixed it and then explained it afterwards, it's obviously been a little bit more confusing. So where I'm going with that is, on education, we've taken the time, we brought in the vast, wide cross-section of educators, school board members, parents, teachers, private school, public school, really to put that process together. Most voters don't know much about it because we haven't been fighting about it. We've been working together on it. But I look in the future and say, we can lead the country. We can lead as a contrast to No Child Left Behind. We can have high standards. We can have standards that include not only where kids are at, but where they've moved. We can have all sorts of factors that tie into how we judge and measure our schools, our teachers, and our districts. And we can do it for all of our kids. Because to me, I don't care whether it's a traditional public school, a charter school, a virtual school, or a choice school. My goal is to make sure every kid in the state has access to a great education, no matter where they come from, no matter what their zip code, no matter what their parents do. And I think we're well on our way to doing that. One other quick thing, and Michelle, that's a great point, because overwhelmingly, as I've held listening sessions around the state, when I had the joint one here in Manitowoc and Sheboygan County leaders, small business leaders, I heard time and time again, as I have elsewhere, we have jobs, we just don't have enough skilled workers to fit into them. So keying off of that, working more between schools and our great technical college system to do dual enrollment. It's why we did we worked together with I'm drawing a blank on the name of the scholarship. Used to be I can't think of it right now, but it's the scholarship program they had before that was guaranteed for kids. We transferred that over, working with Covenant Scholarship Foundation, where we worked with the foundation to partner with us and the technical colleges to put in place incentives, not just for scholarships, but targeting to advanced manufacturing. We know there's a predominance of need out there. But the one other, just last little quick thing on education. Tomorrow, I'm going to be in northern Wisconsin, and the school district I'm going to stop at just happens to be where there was a superintendent who last year, when I was taking questions at one stop along the way, talked about, in his case, it was positive, the reforms had helped them. They saved money, hired more teachers, lowered classroom size. But he said something as he was walking away from me that I asked him to come back and repeat so everybody could hear at this forum. He said, the best thing, though, about what you did, about what your reforms did, was I get to go back to my office and work on curriculum instead of worrying about focusing on grievances. And I said, that's really at the heart of it. Because we talk a lot about dollars, and don't get me wrong, dollars are important. I try to keep track of every dollar so I understand it. But the real issue in our schools, it's what we saw when I talked to the guys in the highway department out in Manitowoc County's facilities today. It's what I see all across the state. It's not just the dollars and the cents. It's the fact, particularly in our schools, where the teachers who teach my kids, the teacher whose house I was over at Saturday night because she's one of my wife's best friends, after we were out doing some other things throughout the day, the teachers I knew growing up, overwhelmingly went into education for the right reason. They love kids. They want to inspire kids. But somewhere along the way, this collective bargaining law and the union contracts that went with that co-opted many of the things that make our teachers so exceptional and special to our students. And the great news now is in our schools, those at least that don't, other than the handful that still have contracts, they can actually be engaged in dealing directly with their principals, collaborating together, as we talked about in Fond du Lac, and doing what great teachers want to do and will be able to do now in the future. There were cuts in public education long before I and many of these lawmakers came. The difference was there just weren't any tools given to local governments to accommodate for that. One of the interesting contrasts between that WEAC survey and the one that DPI put out this past week is, they point to an overall statewide slight reduction, about 2% in terms of overall staffing, but they overlook two things. One's more obvious than the other. One is over 40% of those come from three districts: Milwaukee, Kenosha, and Janesville, all three of whom either rushed or had contracts in place before Act 10 went into effect. So you take those off, it's a night and day difference. Overwhelmingly, you've got districts, not all, but you've got a vast majority around the state who are doing exceptionally well because of the reform. The other one's a little less obvious, but as Eric alluded to, I want to reinforce it. In many cases, it's not just about those particular districts or even about pension or health care contribution. It's about changing, and you guys went up to 8. Some districts had only 5 or 6 hours of instructional course participation and went up to just 6 or 7. And those changes, much like Fond du Lac did, allowed them to avoid reducing the amount of teacher time in the classroom, because they didn't have to make up for it with additional staff or substitutes that filled in. And so the practical effect has overwhelmingly been positive in the classroom, which I believe is why the teachers' surveys themselves reflect that, because they're the ones who see it firsthand. They're the ones, they're not doing the overhead counting, they're looking at what is the practical impact in my classroom and in my school, and I think they've largely seen some successes and will again in the future.
Turn those numbers around.
Sure. Well, it's a clear difference between whether we want to go backwards and retreat or go forwards. What I mean by that is, in the 3 years before I took office, 2008, 2009, 2010, when Jim Doyle was the governor and Democrats controlled both the Assembly and the Senate, we lost 150,000 jobs. In fact, the unemployment rate during that time peaked out over 9%. Now, we took action immediately, and actually, again, often overlooked by many in the public because it's been so long, but when we called a special session right off the bat on jobs, not only did all these folks, but a good majority of the Democrats voted for nearly every measure we passed because we knew we had to take immediate action. And I often point out, I get that 250,000, sometimes people, not here, but usually when I'm in Madison, Milwaukee, the press sometimes assumes that they say, well, why aren't you at 250,000 now? And so that goal was to help the people, not the government, the people of the state create 250,000 jobs by 2015. The analogy I often use is when Vince Lombardi took over the Green Bay Packers, they were 1-10-1. He didn't take them to the World Championship the next year. It took a couple years to get back on a winning way, and then eventually it was one of many World Championships thereafter. We're on that pace. It's not going to happen all. It's not going to happen every month by the same average. But we went from 150,000 jobs lost to leveling things out last year. So the first 3 months of this year, even with peaks and valleys, you have a net gain of 15,600 new private sector jobs in the state of Wisconsin in the first quarter. And you have an unemployment rate that's now dropped down to 6.8%, the lowest it's been since 2008, clearly lower than the national average, and in comparison, 2 points lower than our neighbors to the south in Illinois. So do we have more to do? Absolutely. A couple things we've got to tackle. First off, we go back to what we were talking before, particularly when it comes to technical school education, trying to not just get more people in, because when I talked about this at NTC not long ago with Congressman Petri, it's not a funding issue because most of our technical colleges have courses open in things like high-skilled welding and machining. They just don't have enough bodies into those courses. It's why we did the Covenant Foundation issue to try and draw more marketing and attention and focus into those areas, and why we're going to push in the coming year an aggressive marketing campaign in our schools, not only amongst students, but amongst parents and even guidance counselors, because we need as much help as possible drawing people to where there's not only jobs, but where there's great careers, in many cases careers where they're coming out of school getting paid $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 more than kids coming out of equivalent four-year colleges or universities. The other thing is certainty. It's why we've taken action not just on the tax code, but on the regulatory process, so it's streamlined to the point where what we enforce is about common sense, not about bureaucratic red tape. It's certainty when it comes to the cost of litigation in this state, so that we're getting rid of, for our farmers and small businesses, the high cost of frivolous and out-of-control lawsuits. But it's all those factors, and I honestly believe that we are ready to take off, but one of the other big factors that's still awaiting us is the outcome of the June 5th election. I hear from employers all the time, love what you're doing, we're excited about the future of the state, but we're waiting to hire until after these recalls because we're scared to death that we're going to go back in time. Now, you might say, okay, that's all anecdotal, but I'd say that matches with the statistics out there. 2 years ago, Statewide Chamber of Commerce did a survey of employers. They do it every year. In 2010, just 10% of our employers surveyed said that Wisconsin was heading in the right direction. Same survey conducted beginning of this year goes up to 94%. Of course, I'm competitive. I want to know what's wrong with the other 6%, but 94% of our employers think we're heading in the right direction. Similar follow-up survey just conducted a week or two back, asking who's going to hire amongst those surveyed. 87% said they plan on hiring people in 2012. That matches with not just those numbers in a survey. The Philadelphia Federal Reserve Bank does a report. The next quarter, they've got estimated for 3 times as many businesses in Wisconsin are planning to add jobs as those contracting. Manpower's numbers state by state show the next quarter, estimating those things. I think though for many small businesses, they like where we're headed. They're just worried that that might somehow change. So I think the best thing, it sounds self-promoting, but I think it's simple. Based upon the data and what we hear out in the street, the best way for us to dramatically add more jobs in the state is to get past these recalls, to get back focused on providing certainty for employers, and I think we will. Well, first off, per the reaction, you set it up right. Washington, Barrett, politics. This is taking a bumper sticker off of a presidential campaign, and because the stakes of this campaign have grown so much, they're trying to take that sticker. Until you take a bumper sticker for your car, it doesn't stick very well. They're trying to cram it on the state of Wisconsin. That sticker just doesn't stick here. It's nothing more than a political shot because they know they can't win on taxes. They know they can't win on the economy. They know they can't win on fiscal responsibility. I mean, heck, the spokesperson for the state Democratic Party actually told Mother Jones that flat out. They're going to try and win on other issues because they know they can't win on the issues that people care about. What's come up in the last couple of weeks, and I was singing Michelle's praises the other day because she said this very well on one of the statewide TV shows, but just let me be abundantly clear, because there's been great confusion in the media, I think, because it's been intentionally misleading by some in politics. It is against the law in the state of Wisconsin to discriminate against a woman for employment or promotion. It's not just against the law. The Department of the Workforce Development for the state of Wisconsin today, if you've got a case of someone who's been discriminated on for employment, for promotion, or anything else related to employment at your business, if that individual brings that action to the state, not only can they get relief from that, they can get up to 2 years back pay and action taken on it. The only thing that the legislature and I changed by the law we put into place is no longer do the trial attorneys who were cashing in a couple years ago in 2009 on all sorts of goodies get to get their hands on part of the payment involved there. Instead, we get to enforce the law to protect any woman in the state who's been discriminated against. It continues to be the law, and as long as I'm governor, it will be the law in the state of Wisconsin. On the other issues, again, even when it comes to female voters, and Michelle, you can chime in after this, because you've got as much insight as anybody here, not just from being a lawmaker, but from being in the private sector as a business owner. You know, the issues when I travel the state, the only place I ever hear about that question is when a press release has come out from someone in Washington or one of my political opponents. What I hear about when I hear from voters, particularly small business owners who are women, is they're concerned about the economy. They're concerned about uncertainty. They're concerned about high taxes. Particularly small business owners are devastated by high property taxes. That's why us lowering the property tax burden for the first time in 12 years is so important. They're concerned as small business owners about excessive regulation that gets in the way of them being able to run their business and worry about that instead of about all this bureaucratic red tape. They're concerned about access to capital, which is why they want a government that's financially sound. And beyond just business owners, to female voters, particularly to mothers I talk to, they're concerned about making sure their kids don't inherit debt that they're unable to pay, which is what our state and our federal government's done to our kids in the past. And they're ultimately concerned about making sure that someday, when their kids are out of school and looking for a job, that there'll be an opportunity at least for a job here in the state of Wisconsin that will keep them in the state of Wisconsin. Those are the issues I hear from female voters, as well as in most cases from male voters as well. And those are the issues where we've got the upper hand, which is precisely why Tom Barrett, Kathleen Falk, and the long array of people coming in from Washington don't want to talk about any of those issues.